As an experienced web developer, you have probably implemented both client-side validation and server-side validation. Earlier in this day of training, you saw validation messages being sent from the server for you to handle in your Flex application. In this video, you will learn how to perform client-side validation in your Flex application. You will do this using the validator subclasses, which you will instantiate and then trigger with event handlers. Lastly, you will use the validate and validate all methods of the validator class to trigger validation with ActionScript commands. This is the company vehicle request form application. Note that the submit button for the form is outside your field of view. You will just have to trust me when I say I'm clicking the submit button. I have added validators to both these phone number fields to ensure that the user has entered a valid number. A red asterisk indicates that the field is required, although you will find that this is just a display implementation. Applying the asterisk alone doesn't actually perform any validation. When I submit the form without typing any data, red outlines appear around each of the form fields indicating that an error has occurred. When I mouse over any of the fields, you see the validation message stating that the field is required. Note that although the asterisk is only displaying on the mobile phone field, both fields are actually required. If I enter invalid data into any of my fields, like a letter, into the office phone field and then click the submit button again, you will see that the appropriate error message is displayed. This is the starter file for the application. Remember that the form display is actually in the vehicle request form custom component, which acts as the view in our MVC implementation. I am control clicking on the component name to open the associated class file. In the form UI code, I am adding the required property to the mobile phone form item container and setting its value to true. This code will only add the required asterisk to the display and does not perform any validation. I am saving the file and running the application. You can see that when I click in and out of the mobile phone text control or hit the submit button, which is below your field of vision, nothing happens. This demonstrates that the required property of the mobile phone form item control only adds the required asterisk to the display and does not perform any validation. Actual validation in a Flex application is performed using the Flex Framework validator subclasses, which are listed here. Form validation ensures that data meets specific criteria before the application uses it. You use one of these classes to validate that the data entered into the form controls are acceptable before they are submitted. While the validator classes do affect the visual display of validation messages on form controls, they are not actually visual objects themselves. Therefore, in order to create an instance of a validator class, you must place it in the declarations code block where all non-visual elements are added. Generally, you create one validator for each form control. You can give a validator an instance name using the ID property. The source property requires a binding to the instance name of the object you are validating, in this case one of the text input controls. The property argument defines the name of the object's property that you will validate. In my example, I will validate on the text property of the text input control, since the text property contains the text value that the user has typed. Lastly, each validator tag has a required property, which is a Boolean value that indicates whether a value is required in the reference property of the source object. Notice that the default is true and that this is a different implementation than the required property of the form item container. That property only added the red asterisk to the display. This required property for the validators will actually ensure that users enter a value. The phone number validator class specifically validates for phone numbers. I am clicking on the properties link in the upper right corner of the AS docs so that you can see the validation properties that are supported by this class. I can use the min digits property to indicate the minimum number of digits users can type into the text field. I can also use the allowed format characters value to indicate which characters I want to allow in the text fields. Note that the default allowable characters in a phone number validator instance are the parentheses, a dash, a period, and a plus sign. Note that the text input control for the mobile phone number field has an ID property of mobile phone. I am locating the declarations block in my sample file and placing my cursor after the phone formatter instance. I'm adding a phone number validator instance with an ID property of mobile validator. Now I'm adding the source property binding to the value of mobile phone, which is the text input controls instance ID. Remember that by default, if you add a validator to a field, then the field is automatically required, so you do not need to add the required property. I need to tell the application to validate on the text property of the text input control instance, so I'm adding the property with the value of text. You can define a validator to execute based on a specific event on a specific object. First, you add the trigger property to the validator with a binding to the instance name of the object that will trigger the validation. Then you add the trigger event property to the validator to name the event on the trigger that will trigger validation. This form has a button control with a label value of submit request and an ID of submit button. In the validator instance, I am adding the trigger property with a binding to that submit button instance. Now I'm adding a trigger event property set to the click event of the button control. This tells the validator to perform the validation on the mobile phone instance's text property when the user clicks on the submit button instance. I am saving the file. When I run the application and click on the submit button control, you see a red border appear around the mobile phone text input control. When I hover over the field, you see that the validation message states that the field is required. I'm entering a $sign into the mobile phone text input control. When I click the submit button, the $sign disappears. Remember from the last video that the mobile phone number field also applies a phone formatter, which is removing the value if the user entry does not have the 10 digits for a phone number. You can also trigger validation with ActionScript instead of MXML commands. Each validator class has a validate method that can trigger the validation. The validator class also has a static validate all method that you can use to trigger validation on multiple validator instances at once. Static methods can be called directly on the class rather than on the instance of a class. Two benefits for programmatic validation are that you have more precise control over which validation rules are run, and the validation methods will return a successful or unsuccessful indication that you can then use to take other action, like sending the form data to the server. To use programmatic validation, you must first disable automatic validation by removing the validator's trigger property and setting the trigger event property to a blank string. Since there is no event with a blank string as a name, setting the trigger event property to a blank string means the automatic validation never occurs. The validate method of a validator class is used to trigger validation on a single validator object. The benefit of using it over the MXML class is that it returns a validation result event object which has a type property that returns one of two constants. validation result event dot valid and validation result event dot invalid. At the end of the script block, I am creating a private function named validate phones that takes no parameters and does not return any value, as indicated with the void return type. Within the validate phones function, I am creating a local variable that I'm naming event that is data typed as a validation result event object. Since I used Code Assist to assign the data type, FlashBuilder generates the corresponding import statement. I am assigning the event variable to call the mobile validator dot validate method. I'm locating the submit button instance in the form and setting its click handler to the method I just created, validate phones. I am saving the file and running the application. When I click on the submit button, the validation on the mobile phone text input control runs as appropriate, and I can see the red border around the field. When I hover over the field, I see the proper required message. I have been validating the mobile phone form field, but there is another field that also needs to be validated. I can use the validator class's static validate all method to trigger validation on multiple validator objects at the same time. I will pass an array of validator instances to the method as its only argument, and I will receive back an array of validation result event objects, one for each validator that fails validation. If the returned array has a length of 0, then the validation has succeeded. Here's the Office phone container. Note that I have given its text input control ID a value of phone. In the declarations block, I am adding a phone number validator instance with an ID property of Office validator. I'm also adding the source property bound to the phone text input control, the property set to text, and the trigger event property set to a blank string. In the script block, I am commenting out the validate result event class import statement and then adding an import statement for the mx.validators.validator package. I'm also changing the validate phones function to validate form. Within the function, I am commenting out the event variable and its value and replacing them with a variable named validation array that is data typed to the array class and set equal to the validator.validateAll static method. Remember that static classes are called on the class instead of on the instance of a class. This is why I am referencing the validator class in this case rather than a specific validator instance. Within the call to the validator.validateAll method, I am adding array brackets to create an array of validators. I am referencing the mobile validator and Office validator instances. I'm locating the submit button instance and changing the value of the click event to validate form. I'm saving the file, and when I run the application, and click on the submit button, you can see that the Office and mobile form fields validate at one time. For your next step, work through the exercise titled Validating Form Data.